Detroit never really sleeps, but tonight it felt like it was holding its breath. A cold wind swept through the east side, rattling the rusted street signs and stirring the tattered flags outside the shuttered storefronts. The flickering neon from the gas station barely lit the cracked pavement beneath it, casting shadows that danced like ghosts. Clarence Hayes stood alone at the payphone. 63 years old, shoulders hunched in a worn army jacket 2 sizes too big, eyes heavy with something deeper than exhaustion. His trembling hand held the receiver against his ear. Blood, someone else's, spattered the sleeve of his coat and trickled down his wrist. The phone clicked. 911. What's your emergency? Clarence didn't speak at first, his breath fog in the cold. The silence stretched long enough to make the dispatcher repeat the question. He swallowed hard, then finally said, voice like gravel scraped across concrete. I just did something I can't undo. Not far behind him, police cruisers cut through the dark. Sirens off, lights spinning red and blue like some twisted carnival. They rolled into the parking lot of Johnson's Diner. And there, just 20 yards from where Clarence stood, lay the body of Dominique Love. Her black coat was spread open like broken wings. Blood pooled around her chest. One stiletto heel still clung to her foot. The other was lying in the grass. She'd been laughing just an hour ago. Laughing and talking about second chances. Now she was dead. Clarence didn't resist. When officers approached, he placed the gun gently on the concrete and raised both hands. I didn't know, he said softly, to no one in particular. She should have told me. Before I started falling. And with that, the tragedy began. Clarence Hayes wasn't the kind of man who sought attention. He wore plain flannel shirts year-round, ironed the creases into his khakis himself, and still used the same electric razor he bought back in '89. He drove a '98 Chevy Impala that coughed every time it turned left. His life was predictable, controlled, quiet. Some would say small. But to Clarence, small meant safe. He came from a time when men didn't talk about their feelings, and pain wasn't something you shared. It was something you buried, especially if you were a black man raised in Selma, Alabama, where the church was law and crying made you weak. His daddy was a preacher. His mama played piano every Sunday in white gloves. And every Sunday, Clarence sat still in a wooden pew with his hands folded, being taught that there was one way to live, God's way. And any man who strayed from that path was either lost or damned. When Clarence turned 19, he enlisted, didn't ask permission, didn't even tell his parents until he was gone. He just knew he needed to get out of Alabama before the fire burning in his chest turned him into someone his father would never bless. The war gave him an excuse. Vietnam, 1975, a place where nothing made sense, but everything felt real. He watched friends bleed out in the jungle mud and saw horrors that no sermon could ever prepare him for. He came back changed, quieter, meaner. He got married 6 months after his return, not because he was in love, but because Marilyn Evans was the only person who didn't look away when she saw the darkness in his eyes. She didn't flinch. She didn't ask questions. She just made sweet tea, kissed him on the forehead, and said, "You're home now." And that was enough. For a while. They had one daughter, Candace, and a house with a creaky porch in southwest Detroit. Clarence worked at the GM plant for 27 years before retiring early when Marilyn got sick. He bathed her when the cancer left her too weak to stand. Read scripture to her when she couldn't sleep. And when she passed, one slow breath on a Thursday morning, Clarence held her hand until it turned cold. After the funeral, he stopped talking for a week. He didn't cry. He just shut the world off. The church folks brought him food. Candace visited more often, pushing him to join grief groups, book clubs, even bowling leagues for widowers. But Clarence wasn't interested. Every room without Marilyn in it felt hollow, like nothing could echo right. He filled his days with routines: oatmeal at 7, coffee at 9, lunch at noon. He watched old John Wayne movies and reruns of Good Times. He ironed his socks. But time had a cruel way of lingering. After 4 years alone, even Clarence began to admit he missed more than just his wife. He missed being seen, missed hearing his name spoken with warmth, missed feeling needed. Then one morning, while walking past Miss Patty's porch, his nosy 70-year-old neighbor who always smelled of lavender and menthols. She called out, "Clarence Hayes, when's the last time a woman told you look good?" He scoffed. "Ain't my season anymore." "Oh, hush," she waved. "You still got all your teeth and your pension. That makes you gold out here." He chuckled half-heartedly. She handed him a flyer for a community tech class at the senior center. "They'll teach you how to use a phone smarter than you, and maybe help you meet somebody who don't just make your coffee." Clarence didn't go for 3 weeks. But eventually, after one too many nights eating microwave dinners in silence, he showed up, learned how to swipe, how to tap, how to download an app called Soul Match. His profile was bare bones. Retired Army vet, likes jazz and quiet mornings. Just looking for someone honest. He didn't expect much. Most of the women who messaged him were half his age or looking for sugar daddies, as Miss Patty warned. Then came a message at 9:14 p.m. on a Friday. "You look like a man who still opens doors. My name's Dominique, and I like men who remember how to dance slow." He stared at her photo for 10 minutes. She was beautiful. Smooth, dark skin, wide-set eyes with lashes too perfect to be real, full lips, and a smile that felt like a secret meant only for him. She wore a red scarf and gold hoops. Her bio was short but tasteful. Stylist, dreamer, believer in second chances. Something about her called to him. Not just lust, but curiosity. Hope. Clarence typed, then erased, then typed again. "If I open the door, you better be ready to walk through it." She replied with a laughing emoji and a heart. 3 days later, they agreed to meet. Sunday dinner. Johnson's Diner. 7 o'clock sharp. Clarence shaved that morning. Took an hour picking out a shirt. Wrote out a prayer on a folded slip of paper and tucked it in his wallet. It had been 43 years since he'd gone on a first date. He had no idea it would be his last. Dominique Love had spent her entire life learning how to survive silence. Not just the kind that fills a room after someone walks out, but the kind that hangs in the air when you say who you are and the world decides not to answer. She was born Darren Eugene Love on a sticky July afternoon in 1985 in a Detroit hospital that smelled like bleach and broken dreams. Her mother, Bernadette, was a tired woman, with calloused hands and too many bills. Her father, Eugene Sr., was already gone by the time she turned 3, off chasing some younger woman across state lines, leaving behind nothing but an old Bible with cigarette burns on the cover. From the beginning, Dominique knew something was different. Not wrong, just off. She hated sports, loved her mother's church hats, spent hours brushing her cousin Tia's Barbie doll hair, whispering little secrets and pretending the dolls could understand her better than people ever did. But when she tried to wear a towel like a dress, her uncles laughed like they were watching a clown show. Her aunt snatched it off, slapped her wrist, and said, "That ain't cute. Don't you bring that shame into this house." So she stopped showing the world who she was. Not because she wanted to, but because the world had made it clear there'd be consequences. At 17, she dropped out of school. At 19, she started doing hair out of her kitchen for cash, mostly braids and weaves, the kind of work that let her stay invisible. At 25, she packed a small suitcase, took the night bus to Atlanta, and stayed away for almost 5 years. It was there, with the help of a support group and 2 part-time jobs, that Darren began living openly as Dominique. The first time she looked into a mirror after her transition, she didn't cry. She smiled, a small, fragile thing, and whispered hi. It was the first time she'd said hello to herself. But Atlanta was expensive and cruel in its own ways. After a bad breakup with a man who used her and then outed her, she moved back to Detroit. Older, wiser, still hopeful. She found a salon chair to rent at Heaven's Crown, a beauty shop on 6 Mile run by a no-nonsense woman named Regina who didn't care where you came from as long as you showed up on time and paid your rent. Dominique became known for her hands, gentle, fast, graceful, and for her laugh, deep, melodic, the kind that made even the grumpiest customer grin. She had a gift for making people feel beautiful, even when she wasn't sure she believed it about herself. But love? That stayed elusive. Most of the men who came around only stayed in the shadows. Late-night texts. Promises whispered in parking lots. Quick glances in public, but no hand-holding, no real commitment. She was tired of secrets, tired of being someone's guilt. That's why she joined Soul Match. Not to find a savior, just to find someone who didn't flinch. When Clarence messaged her, she almost didn't reply. His profile was plain. His photo had terrible lighting. But there was something gentle in the way he wrote. No slick pickup lines. No thirst. Just, I open doors. I drink coffee slow. I believe in God and jazz. She laughed out loud at that last one. God and jazz. Maybe that's all a person really needed. They talked for a week. She didn't tell him about her past. Not yet. She wanted him to know her first. The Dominique that danced around the kitchen while cooking sweet potatoes. The Dominique that still wrote poems in the margins of old receipts. The Dominique that believed, against all odds, that love was still possible. When they agreed to meet, she bought a new scarf, painted her nails burgundy, wore her best lipstick. As she looked in the mirror that night, Dominique whispered, "Please, God, let him see me." She arrived 10 minutes early to Johnson's diner. The neon sign flickered, casting soft reds across her cheekbones. She slid into a booth by the window and ordered tea. Clarence walked in exactly at 7. He was taller than she expected. A bit slimmer too, but his eyes, kind, tired, cautious, they told her everything she needed to know. She stood, extended her hand. "Mr. Hayes?" He blinked, took it gently. "Miss Love." Their dinner was easy, unhurried. They talked about their favorite jazz records, her Billie Holiday hymn, Thelonious Monk. She told him about her mother's gumbo, and how no one's ever made it quite right since she passed. He told her about Marilyn, and how the silence after she died made the walls feel haunted. Dominique leaned forward. "I think you're carrying more than you let on." Clarence smirked, eyes glinting. "A man like me learns to hold a lot. But maybe it's time to set some things down." She smiled. That smile, it was full of warmth, full of light. And in that moment, Clarence felt something shift inside him. For the first time in years, he didn't feel like a ghost. When the bill came, he insisted on paying. Walked her to her car, the way old-school men do. The air was colder now, wind curling around them like a whisper. Her coat fluttered open just slightly. He saw something, a faint scar, horizontal clean, the kind that told a quiet story. His smile faltered. Dominique saw it, and in her chest, something tightened. "Clarence," she began softly, "before you go home tonight, there's something I should tell you." And just like that, the night began to unravel. Clarence's eyes narrowed the moment he saw it. That thin, almost surgical scar running just beneath Dominique's collarbone. It was only visible for a moment, when the wind pulled her coat open, but it was enough to stir something inside him. Something ancient, something angry. He'd seen scars like that before. Back in field hospitals during the war. Back in the city when his cousin Lenny went under the knife to remove a tumor. But not here. Not on a woman like Dominique. Not on someone who just laughed with him about how the saxophone could sound like a broken heart. Clarence took a half step back. "Where's that from?" he asked, his voice low, hard around the edges. Dominique's face softened instantly. She reached for the coat, tugging it closed, but she knew it was too late. She glanced away for a second, gathering air. "It's a long story," she said gently. "But if you'll let me, I'll tell you the truth." Clarence didn't say anything. He just stood there, hands in his jacket pockets, jaw clenched so tightly it made his ears ring. Dominique looked up at him. Her voice was soft, but unwavering. "I'm a transgender woman, Clarence. I was born male, but I've lived as myself for over a decade now." It was as if all the noise in the world stopped. Even the wind seemed to go silent. Clarence blinked slowly. "What? I didn't mean to deceive you," she said, stepping forward. "I wanted to tell you sooner. I needed you to see me first. Not what I was born as. Who I am." But Clarence wasn't hearing poetry anymore. He wasn't seeing the woman who'd made him laugh over catfish and sweet tea. All he saw was a betrayal. "You sat across from me, prayed with me, talked about God." He stopped himself, his chest rising and falling like a storm swelling beneath the surface. "I never lied," Dominique whispered. "Yes, you did," Clarence barked, voice cutting through the air like glass. "You let me sit there thinking you were a woman." "I am a woman, Clarence." I fought my whole life to live as who I truly am. Clarence turned away, pacing now, hands shaking, breathing heavy. No, no, this is sick. This is wrong. Dominique's voice cracked, but she stood firm. What's wrong is thinking I owe you shame for being who I am. You should have told me, he snapped, spinning around. You don't play with a man's heart like that. Don't bring me out here, dress it all up with smiles and jazz and soft words, just to tell me I've been sitting across from a damn man all night. She flinched at the word. I'm not a man, she said, her voice trembling now. I'm a woman who's been honest with herself in ways most people never are. Clarence shook his head. This ain't right. This ain't God's way. Dominique exhaled sharply. Don't you dare throw God at me, Clarence. You think he's never seen someone like me before? You think he don't know my name, my tears, my prayers? You think God makes mistakes? Clarence stared at her, and for a brief moment, there was a flicker of something else. Not anger, not confusion. Fear. Fear that he'd felt something for someone he wasn't supposed to. Fear that the world he'd held together so tightly with scripture and discipline was suddenly cracked wide open. And beneath that fear, shame. He turned abruptly and marched toward his car. Dominique called out, Clarence, wait. But he didn't stop. He yanked open the passenger door, reached into the glove box, and pulled out something cold. Heavy. Familiar. A .38 revolver. Dominique froze. Her heels clicked on the pavement as she slowly backed away. Clarence, no. Don't do this. Please. I told you because I trusted you. He didn't look at her. He stared past her, at some image that didn't belong to the moment. Maybe his father's church. Maybe Marilyn's face. Maybe the mirror from earlier that day, where for the first time in years, he'd thought he looked like a man someone might still want. You tricked me, he whispered. I never did, she said, tears now slipping down her cheeks. I gave you the truth. That's more than most people ever do. I gave you my time, he said, voice rising. My story. My wife's memory. And you made a fool out of me. Dominique's hands were raised now. Clarence, you're not a fool. You're scared. But you don't have to be. He looked at her then. Not at her body. Not at her voice. At her eyes. And something inside him cracked. He raised the gun. No, please. A single shot tore through the silence. Dominique collapsed to the asphalt, her coat blooming red beneath her. One hand reached toward him before going still. Clarence stood there, arms shaking, the revolver smoking in the wind. And then, just as suddenly, he lowered the gun. He looked around. The diner's back door creaked open. A cook stuck his head out, eyes going wide. A woman screamed from across the parking lot. Clarence stepped back from the body, as if waking from a bad dream. His lips moved, barely audible. She should have told me sooner. He sat on the hood of his car, placed the gun beside him, and pulled out his phone. The call connected. I just did something I can't undo, he said. When the officers arrived, he didn't fight. He didn't run. He just stood with his hands raised, face blank, eyes hollow. Dominique's body lay motionless beneath the spinning red and blue lights. Her scarf caught in the wind, fluttering like a broken ribbon in the dark. And for the second time in Clarence's life, he had lost the only person who ever looked at him and truly saw something worth loving. Clarence didn't cry when they cuffed him, didn't resist, didn't speak. He lowered his head as the steel kissed his wrists, eyes locked on the dark stains spreading beneath Dominique's body. One of the officers gently nudged the revolver away with his boot, then looked back at Clarence as if waiting for an explanation that never came. But how do you explain that kind of moment? That kind of unraveling? How do you explain shooting someone you just prayed with? Inside the cruiser, Clarence sat motionless. No questions, no outburst, just the hollow stare of a man whose entire world had shattered in a single trigger pull. At the precinct, they booked him under fluorescent lights that made everything look too real. His fingerprints blackened the card. His mugshot was blank. No rage, no regret. Just a man who looked like he'd aged 10 years in 10 minutes. Detective Renee Marshall took the case. Veteran cop. Black. 48. Wore tailored suits and a permanent frown. She'd seen a lot in her 20 years with Detroit PD. Drive-bys, domestic murder, drug wars. But this one made her chest tighten. She walked into the interrogation room with a folder tucked under her arm and a weariness in her step. Clarence looked up when she entered, eyes narrowing. "You a lawyer?" "No," she said, pulling out the chair. "I'm the one asking the questions." He nodded slowly. "Then I guess I'm the one not answering him." Renee sat across from him, opened the file, and looked at the crime scene photo of Dominique. Her body curled slightly, like she'd fallen mid-sentence. "She had a name," Renee said softly. "Dominique Love." Clarence looked away. "She had a job, a lease, a family that cut her off, but a found family that stood by her. She wasn't some nobody, Mr. Hayes." "I didn't say she was," Clarence replied hoarsely. "No," Renee said, "but you shot her like she was—" Silence. Clarence tapped his knuckles against the table. "She lied to me. She told you the truth," Renee said. "You just didn't like what it was." He looked up sharply. "You don't understand. You weren't there. You didn't see what I saw, feel what I felt. I thought—" He stopped himself, exhaled. "I thought God was giving me something back." Renee's voice softened, but her stare didn't. "And when you found out God's gift didn't look the way you expected, you pulled a gun?" Clarence stared down at his calloused hands. "I wasn't thinking." "No," she said. "You were feeling, and you let that feeling become a bullet." He didn't argue. Instead, he whispered, "I just wanted to start over. I didn't mean for it to end like that." The trial was set 6 months later. By then, the story had taken on a life of its own. Headlines blared. "Veteran kills woman on first date after gender reveal." "Transgender stylist murdered in cold blood outside diner." Clarence Hayes, hero turned killer. In court, Clarence sat in silence while the prosecution laid everything bare. The 911 call, the security footage, the revolver, Dominique's last words. Dominique's best friend, Tia, took the stand. She wore a black blazer and a broken heart. She was scared every time she went on a date, Tia said. But she still believed love was worth the risk. That night, she believed him. The defense painted Clarence as a confused, grieving widower who had been caught off guard by unexpected circumstances. But the prosecutor, Monica Dean, sharp as a razor, wasn't having it. She wasn't an unexpected circumstance, Monica said to the jury, voice ringing clear. She was a woman, a human being, and he killed her because she told him her truth. Clarence took the stand. His voice was low, slow, weathered. "I'm not a hateful man," he said. "I love my wife. I serve my country. I never raised my voice at a woman in 60 years. He paused. "But that night, I felt like the world was playing a trick on me, like I'd been made a fool of. And when a man like me feels foolish," he added, "sometimes he does something unforgivable." The courtroom was silent. "I didn't shoot her because I hated her," he whispered. "I shot her because I didn't know what to do with what I was feeling. And that's no excuse. That's just the truth." Candace, his daughter, sat in the back. She hadn't spoken to him since the arrest. Tears streamed down her face, not for her father, but for the stranger he'd become. The jury found him guilty of second-degree murder. The judge, a black woman in her 60s, looked him dead in the eye when she sentenced him. "Mr. Hayes," she said, "you could have walked away. You could have gone home and cried, prayed, punched a wall, or written a letter. But instead, you pulled a gun on someone who trusted you, who believed in you, and you took her life because she dared to live in her truth." Clarence nodded slowly, eyes wet but no tears falling. "I accept that," he said. 35 years, the judge declared. No possibility of parole. Clarence closed his eyes. The courtroom didn't cheer or jeer. They just exhaled, a long, collective breath, like a weight they hadn't realized they were holding had finally been named. But justice never brings peace. Not really. It just leaves you with a name, a sentence, and an empty seat at a dinner table that will never be filled again. Dominique's funeral was held on a cloudy Saturday afternoon, the kind of day when the sky looks like it's trying to cry, but doesn't quite know how. The service took place at Morning Glory Community Chapel, a small brick church tucked between an old laundromat and a row of boarded-up homes on Detroit's east side. The wooden pews were packed, not just with friends from the salon or neighbors from her block, but with strangers, activists, and members of the LGBTQ+ community who'd never met her but saw themselves in her story. They came to mourn, and they came to be seen. Tia stood at the podium, voice barely steady, dressed in the same black blazer she'd worn at trial. She wasn't a headline, she said, her eyes sweeping across the crowd. She was a friend, a sister, a woman who could turn pain into poetry and still make you laugh while doing your hair. Murmurs of agreement rose gently like waves. She told me once that God made her twice, Tia continued. Once in flesh, then again in courage. A few rows back, an older woman nodded slowly, wiping her eyes with a pink tissue. The sanctuary was quiet, the kind of quiet that isn't silence, but reverence, the kind that makes you breathe slower, feel deeper. Outside, after the service, candles were lit along the church steps. Someone placed a framed picture of Dominique beside them. The same photo from her soul match profile, scarf wrapped gently around her head, smile soft and knowing. Beneath the frame, someone had scribbled in black marker, "You were loved. You are still." 2 weeks later, a mural went up on a concrete wall near 6 Mile. Dominique, painted in vivid colors, her eyes looking skyward, surrounded by lilies and gold ribbons. Below it, the words, "Say her name, Dominique Love." It became a place people visited, not just to remember her, but to remember themselves. Trans women stood in front of it and wept. Older black women left flowers. Teenagers lit candles and whispered prayers. One evening, a local reporter filmed a small vigil there. When asked what Dominique meant to her, a young trans girl barely out of high school said, "She showed me you can be soft and strong at the same time." She didn't die because she lied. She died because someone couldn't accept her truth. And I'm tired of our truths being treated like weapons. Meanwhile, in prison, Clarence Hayes became inmate number 1287559. He was housed in a low-security unit reserved for older inmates with medical conditions. His knees ached. His eyesight faded. He spent most days reading scripture and watching dust dance through the beams of morning light. He didn't talk much to the other inmates. He was polite, quiet, but alone. Once, a chaplain asked him if he believed God had forgiven him. Clarence didn't answer right away, just stared out the window for a long moment, then said, "I think God's been quiet with me lately, and maybe I deserve that." The chaplain placed a hand on his shoulder. "You know what quiet is, Clarence?" "What?" "Room to listen." That night, Clarence pulled out a piece of line paper and began writing. The letter took him 3 days. He addressed it to Dominique's family, not knowing who would read it, or if it would ever be read at all. "I don't expect forgiveness," he wrote, "and I know that whatever pain I feel now is only a shadow of what I caused. But I want you to know, she changed me, even if it came too late, even if I only saw it in the seconds after she fell. She was brave, braver than I ever was. And if God has mercy, I hope he lets her smile again." He folded the letter, placed it in an envelope, and gave it to the chaplain to send. Whether it ever reached anyone, Clarence never knew. But he wrote it anyway, because some truths don't come to save us. Some truths just arrive to say, you could have chosen better. And sometimes, that's the only redemption left. The first time Candace Hayes visited her father in prison, it was spring. She hadn't seen him in nearly a year, not since the courtroom, where she sat with her arms folded, tears sliding down her cheek as the judge read 35 years. 35 years. He'd be nearly 100 if he made it that far. She almost didn't come. It took her weeks to write the email request, days to press send. And then, when the visit was approved, she sat in her car outside the prison gate for 22 minutes, gripping the steering wheel so tightly her knuckles turned white. The prison sat like a fortress of regret on the edge of the city, all dull concrete, razor wire, and broken time. A place where everything felt cold, even the air. Inside, the waiting room buzzed with fluorescent light and nervous energy. Candace sat straight-backed, wearing a navy blue blazer and silver hoops her mother used to wear. Her hair was pulled back into a tight bun, not because it looked good, but because it made her feel strong. Guarded. A door buzzed. A guard nodded. "Hayes," he called. She stood, hands trembling, but she didn't let it show. Clarence shuffled in 5 minutes later, escorted by another guard. He wore a beige prison uniform, collar frayed, and orthopedic shoes that squeaked slightly with each step. His beard was grayer than she remembered, his frame thinner. But his eyes still held the same storm. "Hey, baby girl," he said softly. Candace didn't move. She let him sit, let him breathe, let the silence settle between them like dust. "Finally," she said, "you lost the right to call me that the night you pulled that trigger." Clarence nodded, as if he'd been expecting those exact words. "I know." Candace folded her hands on the table, lips tight. "I'm not here to forgive you," she said. "I'm here because I needed to look in the face of the man who raised me to be kind and ask him how he ended up a murderer." Clarence stared at the linoleum floor. "I didn't wake up that morning planning to hurt anyone." "That's not good enough," she snapped. "You raised me better than that. You taught me to walk away from people who scare me. You taught me to breathe through anger, to pray when I'm confused. Why didn't you do that?" Clarence's voice was low. "I forgot everything I believed in, all in one moment." She shook her head, eyes glassy. "No, you didn't forget. You chose. You chose to be the kind of man who lets pride matter more than someone's life. You chose to protect your comfort instead of her truth." Clarence swallowed. His voice cracked. "She didn't deserve what I did." "Damn right she didn't," Candace said, her voice rising. "She was someone's daughter too. Someone's friend. She was somebody's hope, Dad. And you shot her because what? Because she told the truth late? You ever think about what it cost her to say it at all?" Clarence flinched. "Every day." Candace leaned forward. "She trusted you. That's what kills me the most. She sat there, across from you, and trusted you. And you, the man who taught me how to dance in the kitchen, the man who held Mom's hand while she died, you killed her." The weight of her words sank like stone between them. Clarence didn't try to explain anymore, didn't offer excuses. His eyes filled, but no tears fell. He simply said, "I failed, and if I could trade places with her, I would." Candace stared at him for a long time. "You can't." They sat in silence for what felt like forever. The hum of vending machines, the squeak of shoes down the corridor, the quiet ticking of a clock that never stops, no matter who it leaves behind. Finally, she said, "I came because I needed to say this to your face. I didn't come to fix anything." Clarence nodded. "I wouldn't ask you to." She stood to go, reached for her coat. Then, just before walking away, she turned and asked, "What would Mom think of the man you became?" Clarence didn't answer, and that silence said more than any words could. Later that night, back in his cell, Clarence lay on the thin mattress, staring at the ceiling. The sound of the other inmates talking, laughing, arguing, it all faded into white noise. He thought of Marilyn, of her hands, her smile, the way she used to say, "The measure of a man isn't how he loves when it's easy, it's how he loves when it's hard." He had failed that measure, and in doing so, had lost the last piece of his soul that still felt worthy of being loved. Back in Detroit, Candace stopped at the mural. She hadn't planned to. Her feet just took her there. The candles were gone now, melted into glass jars. But the painting still stood, vivid, radiant, defiant. Dominique's eyes looked out at the street like she was still watching, still waiting. Candace reached into her purse and pulled out a folded letter, one she'd written in the car, unsure if she'd ever deliver it. She knelt beside the mural and placed it at the base beneath the lilies. To Dominique, "I don't know if forgiveness is mine to give, but I want you to know. I see you. I believe you. I'm sorry. You should still be here. See." She stood, wiped her eyes, and walked away. And the mural remained, a monument to a life lost not to violence alone, but to the fear that still haunts far too many hearts. The fear of difference, the fear of truth, the fear that makes a man forget who he was raised to be. 3 months after the trial, a letter arrived at the Morning Glory Community Center, the same place where Dominique once volunteered on Tuesday afternoons, handing out hygiene kits to homeless teens and giving free hair trims to trans girls too afraid to walk into a regular salon. Regina, the salon owner and Dominique's oldest friend, was sorting mail when she saw the envelope. The handwriting was careful, pressed into the paper like each letter had been weighed. No return address, just a name written across the front, "To whom it may concern, in honor of Dominique Love." She almost threw it away, but something, maybe instinct, maybe something softer, made her stop. She opened it slowly, unfolding 2 pages that smelled faintly of stale paper and cheap ink. It was from Clarence Hayes, the man who had killed her friend. Regina sat down hard in the nearest chair. Her hands trembled as she read. The room grew quiet, even though the radio still played old R&B somewhere in the background. "I know I'm the last person any of you want to hear from," it began, "but I've been writing this letter in my head for months. I needed to say something that mattered, something more than a courtroom apology. Because that night, I didn't just kill Dominique. I killed everything she gave to the people who loved her. She was kind to me. She listened. She laughed at my dry jokes. She touched my hand and told me I deserved peace. And for a fleeting moment, I believed her. I believed I could be something more than a widower or a bitter old man. And then, I let my shame speak louder than her truth." Regina wiped a tear from her cheek. "You see, I was taught that men are one thing and women are another. No middle, no gray, just right or wrong. I never learned what it meant to make room. I never learned that love could wear a different shape. What I did wasn't an accident. It was fear, pride. It was generations of silence exploding in one ugly moment. I don't ask for forgiveness, not because I don't want it, but because I don't deserve it. But I do ask that you remember her for who she was in life, not who she became in death because of me." At the bottom, scrawled in shaky penmanship, was a line that made Regina pause. "She changed me, and though I didn't deserve her grace, I carry it with me now, every single breath." Regina didn't tell anyone about the letter right away. She kept it in a drawer at the front of the shop, beneath the spare appointment books and half-used polished swatches. But it stayed with her, like a splinter in the soul. She thought about showing it to Tia, to the girls at the Tuesday meeting, even to Candace, but none of it felt right. Until one afternoon, months later, a young trans girl named Myra came in, shoulders hunched, eyes low. She didn't speak much, just whispered, "Can you help me look like me?" Regina nodded. "Of course, baby." As she brushed Myra's hair, she saw the familiar fear. The same quiet pain she'd seen in Dominique all those years ago when she'd first walked in her shop and said, "Regina, I just want to be seen." That night, Regina pulled the letter out of the drawer, copied it by hand on a clean paper, and placed it in a notebook marked Dominique's Corner. A notebook filled with affirmations, stories, and photos, a place where trans women could leave something behind, something sacred, something brave. Clarence's letter became the first page, because even monsters sometimes leave behind a crack of light. In prison, Clarence didn't know the letter had been received. He didn't ask. He simply kept writing, not to be published, not to be read, but because it was the only way he could keep himself from drowning in the weight of what he had done. He wrote about Marilyn, about his childhood, about fear, about the night he met Dominique, and how her laugh had reminded him that life still had sweetness left. He wrote about the bullet. He wrote about silence. He wrote as though maybe, somehow, Dominique could still hear him. Spring returned to Detroit the following year. The lilies bloomed earlier than usual, and beneath the mural, someone taped a new photo of Dominique, one that hadn't been seen before. She stood in front of the church, head tilted, grinning at something just outside the frame. Light danced across her skin. Below it, written in soft black ink, "You didn't die invisible. You were loved. You are still." And in that love, in every candle, every note, every act of remembrance, she lived again, not as a victim, but as a voice. Years passed, but Dominique's name never disappeared. It was spoken in city council meetings, where activists demanded stronger protections for trans lives. It was written in chalk on sidewalks during Pride Month, surrounded by hearts and sunbursts. It was printed on pins worn by stylists, social workers, and strangers who'd never met her but felt the ache of her story in their bones. Her name became more than a headline. It became a vow. At Morning Glory Community Center, Dominique's Corner grew into a full wall, covered in photos, quotes, scribbled notes from young trans women who sat in folding chairs late at night, whispering dreams they were still afraid to say out loud. Some of them cried. Some just sat and stared. All of them knew they weren't alone anymore, because Dominique had walked this path first. And even in death, she was still clearing the way. In a quiet prison cell 200 miles away, Clarence Hayes spent the rest of his days in stillness. He never applied for parole, never appealed. He aged quietly, a ghost of the man who once tucked love letters into coat pockets and prayed over dinner plates. When he died, there was no funeral. Just a single cardboard box returned to Candace, marked personal effects. Inside was a Bible, a photo of Marilyn, a spiral notebook filled with letters he never mailed, and a folded page labeled Dominique. Candace read it in her kitchen, hand pressed to her mouth. And for the first time in years, she wept. Not just for the woman her father killed, but for the man he could have been. Dominique Love didn't leave behind millions. She left behind something harder to measure. A truth lived out loud, a light that refused to dim, and a legacy stitched into the hearts of every person who now dares, in a world still learning how to listen, to be exactly who they are. Unapologetically, completely, and beautifully seen.